Hey guys, part 2 of the headboard build. Carcass is all glued up, so I'm moving on to the boards that make the legs kind of an L shape, something like this. This right here is the face that will drill some holes. This is how the headboard is going to attach. There's two things to note about this. One, this piece that's going to form the other angle of the leg is about 1/4 of an inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch shorter than the outside leg. That's on purpose. This thing is going to sit on carpet and I don't want it to drag, so I wanted to leave that space for the carpet pile so that it really is only sitting on this outside leg. Thing number 2 is that the cross piece can't be flush with the back of the leg. There's baseboard along the floor of the wall where this is gonna want to press up against, and in order for it to sit flush and flat against the wall, I need to be able to make about 1/2 an inch cutout, maybe 3-4 inches, something like that, up the leg here. And I got to leave room for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use biscuits to attach this cross piece to this leg, and I'm going to set the depth on the biscuit cutter to 1 inch, plus or minus. That should give me plenty of room for my cutout, and then the 3/8 of an inch thickness that is half of the thickness of my board here, and everything should line up real nicely. It doesn't matter exactly where these biscuits are, and it certainly doesn't matter that the two legs are identical, but the engineer in me can't resist. So I've got a 2-foot long board here. I'm going to put 3 biscuits in it, 1 every 6 inches. The biscuit slots get cut in the edge of the cross piece of the leg. So I have to take this line that we drew and extend it across the face so I have something to line up the biscuit cutter with, and I adjusted it to 3/8 depth to put the biscuit in the middle of the center. All right, well, the glue dries on the legs. Let's turn to the last piece of actual construction, which is this decorative trim piece. This piece goes right here inside the carcass and just serves as a nice little scalloped detail. It also keeps the bigger books from sliding out and hitting you on the head. Always good when you're a 6-year-old. This piece of stock is 1.5 by 3/4 thick. And what I really want to do is I want to scallop out halfway from the front to the back and halfway from the top to the bottom as the piece is sitting here. What I'm going to do is just mark this out very carefully, and I'm going to have at it with a sanding disc on the angle grinder. So this is essentially a form of power carving, just with, cheap angle grinder sand discs instead of those nice power carving tools. French curve is the tool for this job. I already laid out the swoops on here. I divided it up into, 8 equal sections, and I have those marked halfway back. I'm getting ready to mark the same sections halfway down on the edge piece here. And the French curve is great for determining, what's a nice even curve between any sort of random 3 points. To make sure that they all come out the same, I figured out what I wanted, and I marked the ends with this blue tape on here that you probably can't see, so that I can just line up the tape with the end points. And I know when I've got the French curve equal in the center to my pencil mark that I have the curve I want and that it'll be the same every time. 60 grit wheel on an angle grinder makes short work of pine. I'm trying to keep it moving, keep everything even, and not take away too much of the wood. I'm going to come back and hit this then with the rounded back side of my hand sanding block, try and even out the curves and work down to my line. Well, there you have it. After copious quantities of hand sanding to smooth all of these things out, round over the edges, and get all the points to come together kind of the same, this isn't bad. I would suggest, though, maybe if you're in a softwood like pine, 60 grit is pretty aggressive. It goes really fast. 120 probably would have given me more of an opportunity to think about what I was doing before I turned this whole thing into sawdust. You may notice that it's not quite as wide as it started out. Once I got it all carved up, I set it in here and I was looking at it, and quite frankly, it's just too chunky. There's too much of it. I guess in my head when I was thinking about this, I hadn't really considered that I already had 3/4 of an inch at the top here. So I cut off, I don't know, 3/8, a fat 3/8, maybe as much of a 1/2 an inch once you count the saw blade kerf, just to trim this thing down so that when it's all together, it looks a little bit more balanced and natural. With the trim piece glued in, I can go back and round over all of the quarters with the router and a 1/4 inch round over bit. Doesn't everybody hang their shop vac from the ceiling? With the exception of the back, which is nothing more than a 1/4 inch rabbet and a piece of cheap old ply glued in there, the construction of this thing is pretty much done. I had to bust out the hand sanding block and finish up the roundovers in the corners where the bit won't go, and blend this round over into this scallop and things like that. And I have sanded the whole thing to 150 grit. It feels pretty good, feels pretty smooth. So the next step is to think about really preparing for finish. First step for me is to pre-raise the grain. I'm going to hose this thing down with some distilled water, and that's going to do 2 things. It's going to bring up that grain, so when I do my final 220 grit sanding, I'll knock that down. I don't have to worry about it coming back up. And it also is going to show me a lot of the defects that would otherwise not show up until you got some finish on it. Now, first coat of finish is just a sealer coat of shellac, so all hope is not lost if something shows up at that point, but still, water's cheap. Let me show you the kind of thing that the water reveals that the finish will also reveal. In this corner right here, you see that there is a difference in the color. There's some white streaks in here that don't really look like white streaks of pine. It's because they're not. Those are glue streaks. I got a lot of squeeze out in this one joint when I put it together, and I thought I got most of it out, but obviously I didn't. So I'm gonna have to come back in here with a folded up piece of sandpaper and clean out that corner a little bit more. Otherwise, I'm gonna have that same look in the finished product. Unfortunately, because pine is a bit of a blotchy wood, we're gonna have to take about 3 steps to get this thing prepped and finished. Step 1 is a seal coat of shellac. This is to essentially fill up the more absorbent parts of the wood with something clear, so that we end up with a surface that has a much more even absorption rate when we get to something that has color. Out of the can, the shellac is a 2-pound cut. That's too heavy for this application. The pine isn't that blotchy. I'm going to be using a stain instead of a stronger dye, and in fact, the stain I'm going to use is a gel stain, which helps with blotchiness to begin with. So I'm going to dilute the shellac, 1 part out of the can, 2 parts out of the alcohol can. It's going to give me somewhere between a 1/2 and a 1-pound cut. Should be perfect for this application. Here's the good news. Shellac is probably the only thing that's even faster than painting. You just wipe it on with a rag, and because it's alcohol-based, the solvent flashes off really fast. It dries in probably 10 minutes. Make sure you have plenty of good ventilation, though, so that alcohol fume has somewhere to go. Even coverage is the key to this step. At long last, it is finish time. The shellac is dried, sanded to 320. I routed the back out for the back of the bookshelf, so we're down to applying the stain. Here is my stain. It's General Finishes Brown Mahogany Gel Stain. Gel stain in and of itself helps to control blotching. So combined with the shellac pre-seal that we did, cross your fingers, we should be in good shape. This stuff is thick, 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 thick. It's like pudding in the can. It is definitely a wiping application. So get you a clean cloth and an old t-shirt you don't care about, and go to town. The gel stain's no harder to apply than the shellac. It just takes a little longer because you want to make sure you get even coverage with the color, and because the stuff is so thick, you have to spend a good bit of time pushing it around. Switch to a clean cloth and wipe off the excess. Well, the stain's on. It's brown. I like it. I think 1 coat of stain is going to be dark enough. That gel stain is great stuff. It's murderously expensive, but between that and the shellac, I got about as much blotch control as you could expect to get out of pine and still have it take this much color, especially in 1 coat of stain. course, we won't really know what it's gonna look like until we get this on it. This is Armor Seal, General Finishes Satin, poly that can be wiped or brushed on. I'm probably just gonna wipe. Being another oil-based product and from the same manufacturer, I know I'm not gonna have any compatibility problems between the stain and the poly, but I still have to wait for it to dry. And I have a run across the state to do over the next day or two. So that should give the stain plenty of time to sit. We'll come back, abrade it with some steel wool, and then get to building. Putting on the Armor Seal urethane is really simple. Grab a clean cloth, put some on there, and wipe it back and forth. Nice long strokes with the grain. The only thing you gotta watch is the pressure. If you're pushing too hard, you'll leave streaks in it. Just ease up. I level out the first coat of urethane using steel wool and mineral spirits to help lube it up. Subsequent coats of the urethane, it's just dry steel wool until the very last coat of urethane goes on with no buffing at all. After my 3 coats of urethane, the back goes in, it's glued, and brads to hold it while it dries. Back's in place, this thing is done. Really a pretty easy project when it's all said and done. None of the joinery is terribly complicated. Pine is soft enough that if you have to go back with a chisel and finesse something, it's pretty easy to do as long as you're careful. And even the finish, as blotchy as pine tends to be, if you take the time to shellac seal it and then just sand that back a little bit, it won't give you any trouble. I'm pretty happy with the match between the birch plywood back and the pine. The stain came out even and plus or minus the same color. Probably could have gone one more coat on the back, darkened it up just a little bit, but since it sits back in shadow, I don't think you're ever gonna notice. Only thing left to do now is drill some holes down here to mount this to the bed frame. But I'm gonna let the finish cure probably for another 24 to 48 hours before I take it in there, because the instant it shows up in my son's room, he's gonna start putting plastic Skylanders and library books and whatever else on here. I wanna make sure that that urethane is 100% as hard as it's gonna get before I unleash a 6-year-old on it. So the install is gonna have to wait for another day. Until then, stay safe, YouTube. Thanks for watching.